The next speaker is Kim O'Connor, who became Conservation Program Manager for the U.S. Navy's Pacific Fleet after serving as the Botany Program Manager on San Clemente Island. So I haven't had the opportunity to interact with Kim until this, but I know several people who have worked for her, and they speak so highly of her. They obviously have a ton of respect and admiration, and now I can see why. So really excited to have her here. She'll tell us about the natural recovery on that island after the removal of feral goats, the extensive rare plant recovery, and habitat restoration efforts that are now leading to the delisting of 4 endangered plants. Welcome, Kim.
All right, disclaimer here, I have long COVID, so I'm going to try to keep my mask on. Can everyone hear me? Okay, and another one is I came here from San Diego yesterday. I was probably exactly 1 mile behind every hydroplaned wrecked vehicle northbound from Los Angeles, so I am not at the top of my game today, and I'm probably going to be relying on my notes more than most of the other speakers have, so bear with me. Okay, so the San Clemente Island delisting. So 4 plant species and 1 bird species were delisted, removed from the federal endangered species list in January of 2023. So this is a major recovery story. So all of these species are island endemics, San Clemente Island endemics, and you'll see on these slides that sometimes I abbreviate SCI. I know we're not the only SCI, but in this brief, SCI means San Clemente Island. I'll spell out any other of the islands if I ever am referring to them. So for the species, I won't go through them in great detail, but we have 1 passerine bird, that's the San Clemente bell sparrow. We have 4 shrub species. We have the Castanea grisea, so San Clemente Island paintbrush, which is a hemiparasitic plant. We have the San Clemente Island lotus. It's an early successional species, also a shrub. And we have the Malacathamnus clementinus, or the San Clemente Island bush mallow, which is largely clonal. And then we have a perennial forb, which is the San Clemente Island larkspur. So let's see. So this is the largest group delisting in the 50-year history of the Endangered Species Act due to recovery. So it's a really amazing accomplishment. And it was achieved on one of the most heavily used and strategically significant of the DoD training ranges with one of the highest concentrations of listed species. And why is this important? For me, I feel like it's important. It's a success for the Navy. It's a success for the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's definitely a success for the species. But it's also a success for the Endangered Species Act, because for the Endangered Species Act to serve its goals, we must be able to recover species in areas that are heavily used with multiple uses overlay, not just in areas set aside for conservation. So a little bit about the history and geography of San Clemente Island. You'll see the geography, so I've only put up some history photos. So because San Clemente Island is one of the least visited of the Channel Islands, it's not accessible by the public since it's totally military owned and controlled. It's the southernmost of the San Clemente of the California Channel Islands. It's 68 nautical miles northwest of San Diego, 37,000 acres, 21 miles long by 1.5 to 4 miles wide. Has a series of west-facing marine terraces, a central plateau that's largely grassland, and then it has a precipitous eastern escarpment that drops from about 2,000 feet down to sea level, and sometimes 100% slopes. So the history, it's been occupied. Human occupation goes back to at least 8,000 years, and that's based on radiocarbon dating. Habitation was intermittent. There isn't a constant source of water, a year-round source of water on the island, so use was intermittent. And it was largely abandoned by the native peoples by the 1800s. It was the Gabrielinos who were on the island. That's the tribe that was affiliated with the island. In 1769, the Spanish arrived, and then after that, things kind of went downhill from a natural resources perspective with introduction of goats. And we don't have an exact date for that. There were some stories that goats were introduced by the early mariners, but we haven't found real evidence of that on the island. So it looks like on the island they were brought over, and I'll talk about that a little more on the next slide, in the early 1800s. Then we had a period of sheep ranching from 1850 to 1830 to 1934. And you can see the slide there, that's 1933. There were 20,000 sheep on the island at one time. And then in 1934, jurisdiction transferred to Department of Defense. So San Clemente Island natural resources. So it's a very diverse vegetation types. We have grasslands, scrublands, woodlands, dune. You can see there's island oak, woodland in the upper left. And then that central photo, that's all Opuntia littoralis, so prickly pear. And that circle is a person. That's someone from our botany crew. So it has a lot of affinities with Baja California, with the vegetation. And it has the highest level of endemism, of botanical endemism of the Channel Islands. So we are in the process of finalizing a species list, plant species list for the island, and we have about 529 species on that list. I just counted that last night. Based on previous data, though, we had about 66% of the plants on the island were native. There were at least 20 Channel Island endemics, and at least 17 of those are San Clemente Island endemics. And those numbers are fluctuating because of the new list, so I have to get that updated. We also have two federally listed species left on the island, plants after this delisting, and we have 3 state listed species. We have 23 CNPS 1B species, so plants considered rare or endangered in California and elsewhere by the California Native Plant Society. 2 federally listed avian species. We have over 350 avian species recorded. We have the state-listed San Clemente Island fox. It was never federally listed on San Clemente Island because we manage it under a candidate conservation agreement with the Fish and Wildlife Service. We have the island night lizard, which was delisted in 2014. And San Clemente Island supports 90% of the range-wide population for island night lizard. Let's see, next slide. So goats. I'll spend time on goats because they are really the biggest destructive factor that was ever unleashed on the island. The origins are uncertain. They were thought to be mission goats that were brought to Catalina by the sheep ranchers and then brought to San Clemente Island. By the 1970s, the population was about 15,000, and they wrought havoc on the island. I mean, they destroyed the vegetation, denuded the land, and were left down to mineral soils in some areas. And their impacts led to the listing. It was the primary factor behind the listing of 7 San Clemente Island species in 1977. So the species that were delisted recently, plus the island night lizard and the San Clemente loggerhead shrike were listed in 1977. And then by 1981, there were additional 24 plant and 5 wildlife species that were considered for listing. And in 1997, there were 2 additional San Clemente Island species, both plants, that were listed. So the goats were the factor behind driving all of those listings. Between 1972 and 1989, the Navy removed about 29,000 goats. So why did we remove more goats than there were in the 70s? Because anytime there's a delay in the project, the goat populations rebounded. So as was mentioned previously by other speakers, it's really important when you have an eradication program to stick with it, to be able to stick with it. Some of those delays were, not the fault of the Navy, but just, process and lawsuits and things like that. But and they used lethal and non-lethal methods. We did use the Judas goat technique in the end when there are very few goats left. We have to. It's a lot more effort to track down those last populations. And so successful eradication, 1991, the last of the feral goats was removed from the island. So military land use, I'll go through that because that is a factor that separates us from most of the other islands. So it is part of the Southern California Range Complex, and it's the last remaining continental U.S. Navy training range supporting simultaneous ship-to-shore, air-to-ground, and ground troop training, which is really important for the Navy. So who trains there? It's the Navy, the Marine Corps, and then we have joint and international forces. There's fixed wing training, there's helicopter training, amphibious landings, it's a lot of Navy SEAL training, we have UAV training, and RDT&E. So with the island, it's not all, one big concentrated training area. We have some designated training areas where the training is concentrated, and that's shown in the slide or the picture on the right, or some of the training areas. So we have 2 high explosive impact areas down at the southern part of the island, and those are 2 of the blue sort of polygons down at the bottom. They comprise 10% of the island. So when you think about San Clemente Island, it's not, it is a bombardment area, but the areas are relatively small. And even that whole area is not a moonscape. You can walk up to the edge of the impact area and you don't know that you're in it. Most of the impacts are concentrated in some target boxes. Then we have 22 training area and ranges. They comprise less than 6% of the land area. And that's where Navy Special Warfare trains. And then we have 3 assault vehicle maneuver areas and less than 3% of the land area for those. And that's where Marines train off-road with their vehicles. And then we have down the center of the island, that blue area, it's infantry operations area, and it's foot traffic only. So, and some of those percentages overlap, those areas overlap. So a lot of the island is left without, much military training impact, or where the impacts are very dispersed. Okay, so natural resources management, this is sort of how do we, get there? I mean, the goat removal was one thing. But we have a very robust natural resource management program on San Clemente Island. We have a $6 million a year annual budget. So this is why when Heather was talking about, where they spent the money, they didn't need to spend it on San Clemente Island. We have a very robust budget. And the program, so we have a botany program. We do seed collection, propagation. We also do habitat restoration, so site selection, outplanting, maintenance. We do invasive species control, we have vegetation mapping, soil erosion monitoring and control. We have pollinator and vertebrate studies. Then we have a large wildlife program, the San Clemente Island loggerhead shrike. We have a captive breeding and rearing and a monitoring program for that. We also do annual monitoring for San Clemente bell sparrow, the island night lizard, seabirds and shorebirds. Then we have a predator management program. We also do wildland fire management. Fire is a factor on San Clemente Island, unlike the other, Channel Islands, because we do have active training on the island, so we do need to manage that. We install fuel breaks, and then we have a marine program as well. We monitor and manage black abalone, white abalone. We have safety zone monitoring, which is looking at the subtidal areas, and we have rocky intertidal monitoring as well. And most of those are done on an annual basis, so it's a big program. It's a lot of work. So it takes a team, and I'm not going to go through everybody here, but we have a collaboration with Navy, cooperators, and federal partners, and this has really been critical to the success of the program. And I've listed some of the organizations and entities that have worked throughout the years, but this list is so much bigger, than this. It really does take a team. I'm standing here today. I'm privileged to be the one bringing this, to kind of the finish line here, but all of these people contributed, or these organizations contributed significantly to the recovery on the island. So you have to show you some numbers. So what does recovery look like? And we have some pretty big increases in numbers. So I tried to get the number closest to the time of listing, and when these species were listed, the standards weren't what they are now. They weren't as rigorous, so we don't have great quantitative data from the time of listing. But closest to the time of listing, so we've gone with Lotus from about 1,300 individuals to about 21,000 now, so a 16-fold increase. Then with paintbrush, we have about a 48-fold increase. Then the larkspur, there were 2 locations, and one had only 1 individual, and now we've got about 19,000 of them today. And bush mallow, we've gone up by 19-fold. So these are pretty big increases. And then I would like to point out that on the island, we have some areas where topography makes it pretty inaccessible to really know exactly how many species we have. We also have certain areas we can't go because of safety, like the impact areas. And so these are really undercounts. So the recovery is really much greater than this. And then for the San Clemente bell sparrow, the population went from 38 birds in 1984 to an average of 5,000 and something between 2013 and 2018. We use those numbers because that's what was used in the delisting, but those numbers are still accurate today. And the range expanded from about 10,000 acres to 33,000 acres. So they originally had been in boxthorn habitat, and that was their sort of stronghold. And then as their population increased, they expanded into other habitats, and now they occupy most of the habitat types on the island. So the delisting process. So basically, in 2010, the Pacific Legal Foundation petitioned to delist or downlist 6 San Clemente Island species, and the 3 of the plant species that have been delisted now were part of that. And then in 2013, the Fish and Wildlife Service reclassified lotus and paintbrush as threatened, so they downlisted them, but they didn't do anything with the other species. And I think the Navy was a little bit disappointed that we didn't get the species delisted at that time. But the main point here in red is that recovery alone is not enough to delist species. You really have to have documentation, and you really need to demonstrate management of the threats. And that's what we hadn't quite done. So the Navy then started to focus on data compilation and threats analyses, and prepared conservation assessments. So these are internal documents where we compiled all the known information about the species, summarized it, and then we analyzed the threats. And we actually published those. So those are Santa Barbara Botanic Garden, Rancho Santa Ana Botanic Garden occasional publications. And then in 2018, the Department of Defense and the Department of Interior came up with a recovery and sustainment partnership, which provided a framework to focus on recovery and delistings, downlistings where warranted. So that really helped prioritize efforts, staff from the Navy and from the Fish and Wildlife Service to work on documenting and assessing whether these species should be delisted. And then between 2018 and 2020, we partnered on the development of species status assessments for 5 San Clemente Island species. So those were like our conservation assessments, except they took it a step further. They went into future forecasting, so looking at modeling, what happens in the future, what if threats increase, what if populations increase over here or decrease, looking at trends and projecting into the future. So based on the results in May of 2021, the Fish and Wildlife Service proposed to delist all the species, and then they went ahead and with that delisting in 2023. So threats analysis, what's included? So basically the primary threats on San Clemente Island that were analyzed were military training, fire, soil erosion, invasive species. So, for example, for fire, and that's the one on the right, these were heavily GIS, model exercises. We didn't, this wasn't just, before we had kind of done, qualitative analyses, but these were really quantitative. Where is the fire? What's the fire severity? How frequently are the fires occurring? Are they within the return interval tolerance of the plants? And it was a very robust process, and I think it was a very collaborative effort in terms of coming up with what to model, how to model, what to look at, how to consider the threats. So the process. So we had a delisting core team. It was U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with local, regional, and headquarters level, and then Navy. It was myself and the installation biologists, and then we had a lot of coordination up the chain of command. We had a cooperator who was preparing the documents, Texas A&M, and then we had support from our contractors and cooperators. Keys to success. So what was needed here was the strong partnerships was really important. And we'd been working together with the service for many years. In fact, with myself and Brian Munson, Melissa Booker, Sandy Visman, who was with the service, collectively we had 85 years of experience on the island. And that's really key, to success. I think the longevity, overlap, expertise, and passion of the staff and partners is really important. It's not just the expertise; it's the vision and the passion and the tenacity of people. We had also an unbroken chain. So I basically had overlap with Jennifer Stone, the first San Clemente Island botanist. I was also hired by Jan Larson, and he was my supervisor in the beginning. He's the one who was responsible for the goat removal and spearhead that. And just being able to pass that baton, have the continuity of the knowledge, but also the vision and the motivation. And then I think for all of us, it became not just about preserving the resources, but also, I felt entrusted by these people with carrying their vision forward. And so I felt responsible to the people who came before me for continuing their good work. And I think, that's really important. We also did have support from leadership with the Navy and Fish and Wildlife Service. So having a framework to do this in that prioritized it above all of the mundane, tasks that we're normally dealing with every day was really important here. Another thing is that the Navy, I think, has a really rigorous review and approval process for our programming. So our budgets go through a process, and it makes us to think about the future. So I will be programming this year, 3 years out in the future for the next 5 years. So it makes me think not about today, what am I doing today, what am I doing tomorrow, but what am I doing, 8 years from now? And it makes you think ahead, and I think that's really important. Of course, sufficient program funding is important too, and we do have that, and we're well supported. And I think also the culture of stewardship, and this is a term coined by Sandy Visman at the Fish and Wildlife Service. She said that, the Navy really has developed a culture of stewardship here, and I think, all of the things I've been talking about with this show that. And also we have integrative natural resource management plans where all of our projects are incorporated in that. And really, I do believe that that's a deserved term that she used for us. So, and I guess I would like to just encourage people. So, when you're comprising a team, you do have to look at who's on the team. It's not just expertise, but it is the vision, it is the passion, it is the tenacity, it is the spark. And when you're hiring for natural resources professionals, look for the same thing. And I think the next speaker will be an embodiment of that as well, Bill Hoyer. So next step. So, the species are recovered, but it's not over yet. So the Navy has further commitments. So we have a 9-year post-delisting monitoring plan that we are implementing in coordination with the Fish and Wildlife Service. We're in the process of finalizing a Bell's Sparrow management plan, which will become part of, will be implemented under a conservation agreement that we have with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The goat removal was key in the recovery of the species. Apart from the goat removal, most of our projects that have benefited these species have been island-wide ecosystem level projects. So we are going to continue those as well, and that will be covered under the conservation agreement, as well as analyzing impacts to species under the National Environmental Policy Act, and doing avoidance and minimization measures. The delisting, so you might think, well, we're still going to spend all this money, we're still going to do all this stuff. How does the delisting help us? But it helps us by freeing up staff time and consultations with the service when you have an impact or potential impact take up a lot of time. It's 135 days from when you start to when you finish for a formal consultation, and we won't have to do that anymore. We're building that into our conservation agreement that will have some of the same protective measures that would have come out of consultations. And it does allow us to focus on other species that require our attention. So others have mentioned the Santa Cruz Island rock cress project. We're involved in that. It's a recovery partnership with Fish and Wildlife Service and other land managers. We're very eager to free up some of our time to really focus on that. We also have the San Clemente Island Woodland Star, the conservation assessment and management plan. So we're going to go through and develop another internal conservation assessment for that. This one is going to be more action oriented. We are not going to be able to conclude that, oh yes, this is recovered, but it'll help guide our management, and we expect to do more outplanting and things like that to secure that species' future. And we'll also be able to focus more on San Clemente loggerhead shrike, which does need some more focused attention. These are species that didn't just automatically start to recover after the goats were removed. They need more help. Oops, I'm sorry. That's my long COVID here. I didn't get to that next step slide, so I'll give you a moment to look at that. All right. And so, the recovery isn't done. It's still happening, and this is really exciting. So, for example, we rediscovered on the island the island poppy, the island tree poppy in 2021 after, and this is after a fire. So we had a fire that burned the eastern escarpment. I was saying fire can be a good thing. It's generally beneficial actually on the island with the severity of fire we have and the frequency. And lo and behold, species that we hadn't been seen for, probably since the beginning of the 1900s. Now we have three island tree poppies, and we're pollinating them. We're going to try to manage those for recovery. And there's also a brand new discovery, a new species described, and this is the San Clemente Island dune cryptantha. This is by Mike Simpson and John Redman. It was found in 2019 and recently published. So these things are happening on the island, even today, and this is really encouraging for all of us. And so I guess, in closing, because we're playing the long game here in conservation biology, I think you can see, from the other stories. And I'd just like to inspire everyone, natural resources professionals, volunteers, students, donors, who are toiling away on species that facing seemingly insurmountable threats, to the point where maintenance by recovery may be the only thing that you think you can achieve for the foreseeable future. So the first Navy botanist on San Clemente Island, Jennifer Stone, she probably felt that way when she was protecting the last, remaining larkspur plants within fenced goat exclosures. But look at where that got us today. And, I really hope that Jennifer is smiling down upon us today, happy at our success. So I'd just like to say, you might be, wherever you are in the sort of, passing of the baton, the relay race, that conservation biology is, if you're at the beginning and you can't really see the finish line, go for it. Someone's going to pick up the baton and carry it the next way. If you're lucky enough to be at the end of that relay race, carrying the baton across the finish line, don't forget about the people who came before you, because really it's the early efforts that I think were the most pivotal in the success. It's easy to be the last leg. I think it's hard to be the first.